I first began researching the topic of UFOs and aliens from the perspective of a religious researcher, realizing that many people have turned their belief in alien life forms into a religious belief system in itself. It was the Heaven's Gate cult suicide that got me started into this. This talk is nothing on that sort of topic. We'll be doing that later today. This is a very non-religious research lecture. And I never actually intended to become known as a Roswell incident researcher. It wasn't a calling I didn't believe. But because of the work I had in the field and the storefront I had downtown, I was asked almost daily, well then, what really happened in Roswell 1947? My website, ROSWELL1947 is my first answer to that, published in 2002. I'll show you a little bit of that later. And I appreciate everyone being here. I'm going to be presenting some new information for your consideration that is going to strongly argue that the Roswell crash was not the result of an alien spacecraft crashing in the desert. And I know that goes against what a lot of you already probably believe, especially if you traveled to Roswell for this whole event. So I'm very appreciative of the fact that you're even here this early in the morning to give this particular presentation a fair hearing anyway. Seriously, again, thank you all just for being here. And what I'm going to share, I'm simply boiling down, it's a theory, of course. There is no smoking gun. It's just data points that you'll put together in your own mind as this rolls on. I'm introducing you to the research of many, many other people based on findings that have not been that well known for very long at all. And they all add up to a pretty challenging interpretation of the events of 1947. In a perfect world, you'll just listen objectively and to what I'm positing today, and you can walk out of here making a personal decision whether you think this view has any real merit or not. And this same information that I'm presenting, this will lend itself to your understanding of why I don't believe that the Roswell incident was actually a weather balloon, as the Army Air Force stated in 1947, and nor do I believe that the Air Force's 1997 Project Mogul balloon explanation from their Case Closed book, that was their official final word on the Roswell incident. I don't believe that in 1997 has very much resemblance to the truth either. Okay, they first said it was a weather balloon in 1947 after the second press release, harmless high altitude. This is the 1997 Air Force Case Closed book that came out. If you're unfamiliar with these, I want you to know I'm in complete agreement with all the Roswell researchers that you're going to have access to in Roswell this weekend, wherever you go. I also agree that both this 1947 and the 1997 official explanations are so full of holes that we can call them just ridiculous fabrications. There's three main arguments in the ufology field pertaining to what really happened here. There's the alien hypothesis, of course, the weather balloon hypothesis, and this top secret mobile balloon hypothesis that they published in 1997. And those were the only three possible explanations. I'd actually argue that the alien hypothesis is the one that best fits the factual data and the credible eyewitness testimony from 1947. But there's a fourth hypothesis on the table now that's been gaining a lot of ground in the last decade. I'm one of many people that are presenting one version of this or another. 2002, my first stab at it was ROSWELL1947 I'm actually honored if you go online to Google, type in Roswell UFO crash or Roswell UFO, and I am either the #1 or 2 match currently. Been battling out with Wikipedia over that, but that's for 5 or 6 years. And that's no shame in losing to Wikipedia. So you can see that a search result like this is showing that this view is at least becoming influential. Just like the lecture today, my website starts out with an overview of the facts, and then what I've come to call the official mythology. It's the popularized version of the Roswell incident that you're most likely familiar with. I'm going to be taking a crack at just shedding some new light on what you already believe are the basics, but I'm not nitpicking these details apart by any means. Debunking, you know that word, that is not my tactic here. I'm just going to share you a lot of unknown details about what our government and our military absolutely was in very highly compartmental ways, like the Manhattan Project, for instance, were in fact working on in 1947. The facts are in July 47, an unusual craft crashed in the desert of New Mexico. Number 2, the Roswell Army Air Base was involved in recovering that craft and possibly bodies. On July 8, 1947, the Roswell newspaper published a front-page article reading, "Roswell Army Airfield Captures Flying Saucer on Ranch in Roswell Region." Following orders, the military recanted the flying disc press release just hours later, claiming via the next day's paper that it was just a weather balloon. And fact number 5 is that the government has been lying to us about it ever since. As an example of that ongoing lie, this is from the 1997 Roswell Case Closed that I showed you earlier report, stating that the weather balloon was a top secret at that time, Project Mogul balloon. This was released in '97, 2 weeks before the 50th anniversary was celebrated here. They also added this bit about the crash test dummies being the explanation for the bodies that people reported. Problem with that is the researchers immediately pointed out, Stanton Friedman gets credit for saying this first, these dummies had, I think, not even been invented yet in 1947. But they were certainly not used by the Air Force until 1953 for anything. That is so easy a fact to verify. It's led many people already to conclude that not only was the Air Force lying, again, in 1997, but they wanted people to know they were lying. What I'm positing here is that they unofficially, even via the first press release from 1947, they want people, wink wink, nod nod, to believe that the incident was extraterrestrial, to cover up what was really going on. Some very ugly truths. Starting with Operation Paperclip. What you're looking at here is a group of 104 German scientists who were moved here to Fort Bliss, Texas, and to White Sands Proving Grounds, New Mexico. And they were previously working on some very interesting advanced flying craft prototypes for Adolf Hitler in the closing years and months and weeks of World War II. You can Google Operation Paperclip and just start with the Wikipedia entry if you don't already believe me. This photo I got off of NASA.gov. Warner von Braun is among the people here. I copied this picture from NASA, linked to my source, and then they removed the webpage, by the way, in 2002. I've now learned that little handy capture screenshot that comes standard on all of our keyboards. But Warner von Braun, he went on to head NASA's rocket program and take us to the moon. Historians now tell us that had Hitler gotten these working flying machines these gentlemen were working on into mass production, photos which I will be sharing with you, actual photos, before the Allies successfully invaded Germany, that we would have lost the war. The earliest and probably definitive books on the subject of the classified program that brought these men into the United States are The Paperclip Conspiracy and Secret Agenda. This is Tom Bauer's 1987 book, The Paperclip Conspiracy, The Hunt for Nazi Scientists. The review by the London Observer reads on the back of it, as the Allies moved into Germany, the full scale of the Nazi research achievements burst upon them. I skipped the part where they saw thousands of corpses. They overlooked the corpses and went straight for the technological marvels. They grabbed weapons, instruments, tools, files, and above all, scientists. There's also Linda Hunt's 1991 book, Secret Agenda. In the opening pages, she says this book would not exist if it were not for the Freedom of Information Act. Before 9/11, a lot of the now famous documents released to the UFO research field are via the Freedom of Information Act. But she describes in the opening pages of this book that the government fought her so hard on what she was digging up about Operation Paperclip that they actually presented her a bill for $239,000 in what they called search fees. Sounds like they were trying to scare her off. She had some good lawyers that were willing to go all the way with her, though. The gist of all of it is that when the U.S. and Allied troops were invading all of Hitler's secret bases in the closing months of the war, they came across such amazing technology that they wanted it. So those scientists were secretly brought into the United States under a media blackout and a program that literally paper-clipped fake bios on top of their Nazi crime dossiers, because President Truman was personally against putting certified Nazi criminals on the American payroll. President Truman expressly ordered no real practicing Nazis be brought into the U.S., but had that order been followed, even Warner von Braun and the other important scientists would have been excluded. Getting to the relevance of the Roswell incident on this, 1947, I need to credit Dr. Michael Heiser, PhD, and his book, The Facade, for pointing me in this direction of research. A lot of you know his name. He's spoken here in Roswell many times. And his book was first published in the year 2000. My site, Roswell UFO Crash, went online in 2002. And I'm going to share a couple of articles that you can still find online. They're linked to from my site, November 2005, which sum all this up very concisely. This is from BBC, 21 November 2005, Project Paperclip, The Dark Side of the Moon. Some excerpts from it, beyond what's on the screen. 60 years ago, the United States hired Nazi scientists to lead pioneering projects such as the race to conquer space. These men provided the U.S. with cutting-edge technology, which still leads the way, but at a cost. The range of Germany's technical achievement astounded Allied scientific intelligence experts accompanying the invading forces in 1945. And it was the U.S. and the Soviet Union which, in the first days of the Cold War, found themselves in a race against time to uncover Hitler's scientific secrets. Thus began Project Paperclip. The article mentions some details of von Braun's associates also brought into the United States. Arthur Rudolph, Chief Operations Director in Nordhausen, where 20,000 slave laborers died producing V-2 missiles, led the team which built the Saturn V rocket, described as 100% Nazi dangerous type. Kurt DeBoos, rocket launch specialist, another SS officer, his report stated he should be interned as a menace to the security of the Allied forces. Hubertus Strugel, later called the father of space medicine, designed NASA's onboard life support systems. Some of his subordinates conducted human experiments at Dachau and Auschwitz, where inmates were frozen and put into low-pressure chambers, often dying in the process. Now, I want you to see this picture also in the article, which the BBC article has. Take special note of the reference to one of the captured flying craft, the Horton Ho 229. I've underlined this in red. That is not a photo of the Horton, but part of the popular mythology associated with the Roswell incident that many people have published is that our stealth aircraft, namely the B-2 bomber, was back-engineered from the Roswell 1947 crashed ship. It's now known that that's not accurate. With its radar-absorbing wings, carbon-impregnated plywood skin, and swept-back single wing, the 1994 Horton Ho 229 was arguably the first stealth aircraft. The U.S. military made one available to Northrop Aviation, the company which would produce the stealth bomber. All intents and purposes, a modern clone of the Horton, a generation later. The caption, the stealth bomber, based on a 1994 German design. Here's one of the oldest images of the Horton 229 from Wikipedia, from Germany, 1944. Now, I've got more pictures of that, but my point is to simply make you ask and answer this first question for yourself. Seeing these images, would you argue that the B-2 bomber that Philip Corso and others believed was reverse engineered from the Roswell crash was back engineered from alien technology or from German technology? Second article, published November 16, 2005, suggests that what modern UFO researchers, advocates refer to as the truth embargo, to use Stephen Bassett's term, or even Richard Dolan's phrase, the national security state, did not begin in 1947, as most people postulate, but the cover-up of Roswell actually began right here in 1945. Have you paid attention to the media blackout tone in this first paragraph? The front page of the New York Times on November 17, 1945, bore a curious, vague headline: 88 German scientists reach here, reputedly with top war secrets. The scientists had arrived on an ocean liner the day before, about 60 years before this was published, and been immediately whisked away aboard a fleet of buses. Unusual precautions were taken to keep the incident secret, and reporters who went on board the ship and found the 88 men waiting to land were warned away, the Times reported. The paper reported that the group's arrival was announced weeks earlier by the War Department to bring German scientists to America. In spite of the secrecy, the Times guessed right. Men who just 7 months earlier had been at war with the United States were being ushered into our shores by the government. The purpose: to jumpstart American high-tech industry. The article continues, these men and women, this is a little laborious, but it's necessary to lay this foundation, and then it'll roll after this. The men and women were in essence spoils of war, taken by the victor to benefit from the vanquished foe's history of scientific achievement. As Allied soldiers battled their way inland from Normandy, teams of technical intelligence gatherers followed in their wake. Their first real opportunity came after the liberation of Paris in August 1944, when competition among the Allies, particularly the United States and the USSR, but also Great Britain, France, Argentina, hold that thought for later, and Yugoslavia heated up. Rivalries grew fierce in the following months as countries hid information from one another and scrambled to snag the best equipment and talent for themselves. By early the next year, 150 scientists were working across the country at locations like Wright Field, Ohio. Anybody know the significance of Wright Field? Yeah, right. If you know your Roswell story, Wright Field is where the wreckage from 1947 was eventually taken. She continues, the Dora concentration camp had supplied slave labor for the Nordhausen missile workers, where prisoners had been fed a single piece of bread a day and literally worked to death by the thousands. Aviation doctors had suffocated gypsies in pressure chambers and force-fed Jews nothing but seawater for weeks to determine what pilots could withstand. The scientists drew little attention from the American press or public until 1957 when the Soviets launched Sputnik. Suddenly, all eyes were on our rocket team. The assertion that their Germans are better than our Germans, variously attributed to Bob Hope, Lyndon Johnson, and myriad presidential advisors. Some people knew about this. Bob Hope, celebrity, reminds me in the 80s we had Ronald Reagan, Johnny Cash, Bob Hope. Now we have Obama, no cash, no hope. But Paperclip left behind another darker legacy. The program's architects, post-1945, were sometimes willing to build on the results of often deadly Nazi research on captive human subjects. Intelligence and government officials faced a delicate moral quandary in 1945, whether it was worth it to give American homes to men who invented weapons to kill American soldiers, men who in some cases subscribed to beliefs that hundreds of thousands of Americans had died to eradicate. Last sentence, in the end, they decided it was, if these men could help the United States defeat the Soviets. So the author, Miss Gibson, here lays out beautifully the rationale for Operation Paperclip. And the fact that these two separate articles came out in November 2005 kind of indicates that whoever controls the press these days is kind of okay with the American people finding out about the Nazis on U.S. soil 60 years later. But I think you might be beginning to understand. Under no circumstances could that information be let out in 1947. What if you had just lost two sons fighting the Nazis? How would you react if in 1947 find out they're living in the United States and eating well off of your tax dollars? All that I've just read introduces a topic I'll be getting back to later. These paperclip scientists were not only brilliant when it comes to technology, but they were both adept at and willing to perform experiments on human test subjects. Specifically, she said earlier, to determine what pilots could withstand. I'm warning you now, this lecture will take a very dark turn shortly. But back to this Horton. Here's the pictures I promised you. Those are from Germany, under construction late 1944. Here's a modern recreation made for a film documentary. This 2009 National Geographic article documents the recreation of a Horton, noting, as many other sources, mass production of these things could have changed the course of the war. Wikipedia states that these jets exceeded 600 miles per hour in 1944, way faster than anything the U.S. had, and flew almost 50,000 feet. Here's a close-up of that. I know you wanted that. And these last pictures, they're just from a discussion thread, and they don't cite their sources, so I apologize if any of these are, inauthentic, but they're really good pictures. This is the one I'm not sure is truly authentic. This appears to be the one manufactured in the USA by Northrop. So we know that Germany had these vehicles in prototype production prior to the end of World War II. That's a fact. Anybody who wants to dispute this research or do the research themselves, you'll find you can't dispute this. But does that necessarily mean the American military had them? Ever? And what's all this got to do with Roswell in 1947? Here's some documentation from before 2005. This is a January 1946 document from Mike Kaiser's website. You can get it online anywhere too. It originates from, looking at the top right, Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. Again, the Wright Field connection where the Roswell debris wound up. I've added the red text just so you can read the small type. It's unclassified document now. This is the actual cover page. that proves the United States Air Corps had a working knowledge of the German flying wings designed by the Horton brothers and was authorized to begin work on them here in the United States. If that little document is not enough evidence, here's a picture of one being unloaded from a train in August of 1945. The Wikipedia caption reads, "Unloading of a captured Horton Ho in the USA." The Wikipedia entry ends by saying, during the final stages of the war, the U.S. military initiated Operation Paperclip, which was an effort by various research intelligence agencies to capture advanced German weapons research and to deny that research to advancing Soviet troops. This was secured and sent to Northrop Corporation in the United States. Northrop was chosen because of their experience with flying wings, inspired by the Horton brothers' pre-war record-setting glider. Jack Northrop had been building flying wings in the United States since 1939. So why is all that important for today? There's two major reasons. If you didn't work, number one, for the Northrop Corporation or for the United States military compartment that brought this aircraft over here in August 45 from Germany, or if you weren't privy to Operation Paperclip in the mid-1940s, odds are you wouldn't know that a craft of this type, or many others I'll be showing you in a moment, even existed, much less had made it to the United States for R&D. This is important for, number two, for this reason. Who knows who this is? It's Kenneth Arnold, the pilot who in June 1947, said that he witnessed some amazingly fast airships over Mount Rainier in Washington State. He described their flight characteristics as skipping like a saucer. And as a result, in June 47, the press first coined the phrase flying saucer, which is technically wrong. Many researchers often point today, Ken Arnold said it skipped like a saucer, but not that it looked like a saucer. Please keep your eye on the screen real quick here. I'm going to move. Now that we know that these guys were working on reproducing these craft for American use spread across these locations: Fort Bliss, Texas, Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, White Sands Proving Grounds, New Mexico. Who would argue, or who here would now argue, that what Ken Arnold described in 1947 was really from outer space? This is where the word flying saucer was born, that sighting on the left. Some people that are really researched on the Roswell incident already know this part. I think it will interest many of you to know that the craft recovered around the Roswell region in 1947 was not actually round in shape, as you probably have pictured in your head due to cartoon artwork or Hollywood renditions. Most of us know that there's two main books on Roswell that got everyone's attention: Crash at Corona by Dan Bellinger and Stanton Friedman, who's speaking at the UFO Museum this weekend, and The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell by Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt. Don Schmidt also speaks at the UFO Museum almost every year. Of course, both he and Stanton Friedman will propose the extraterrestrial explanation. But you may notice, oh, I don't have that artwork. I'll show you a poster later. I have drawings by Frank Kaufman, who was in the Roswell Army's Air Base 509 bomb squad. He claimed to have been involved with the cleanup of the wreckage and the bodies. The poster he drew is his alleged first-hand eyewitness testimony of what he cleaned up, or at least he saw. And the version of the craft he drew is not round, but it's more manta-shaped than circular. The book, The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell, which the Showtime special, Roswell, the UFO cover-up movie, is based largely on, depends on Frank Kaufman's testimony largely. And notes in the caption, Don Schmidt has this drawing based on Kaufman's and three others' eyewitness testimony. The craft, the caption under the photo, is the craft that crashed at Roswell was long and narrow. It was not a flying saucer. Nowadays, Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt have both stated that they no longer affirm Kaufman's complete testimony, if any of it, but the book that is based on it is still out there influencing young minds today. You'd have to renew their absolute newest material to find out that they distanced themselves from Kaufman after he died. They believed him at the time largely because Walter Haupt recommended him, found one of the co-founders of the UFO Museum. He said that Kaufman's character was sterling. Talk to this guy, he was there. But there are two more of Kaufman's drawings of the craft that he allegedly saw. He published in the book Roswell 1947, I Was There, by Robert Shirky. Shirky is about the only original Roswell witness that nobody has successfully debunked, by the way. Although Walter Howe, he's credible in the fact of his original claim that he carried the Roswell press release that is now famous worldwide, that much is absolutely true. It's just some of his later quotes, and especially the affidavits published after his death, do sometimes contradict each other. His original statements, and many Roswell researchers have detailed the inconsistencies. I'm not going to do that here. All we know for sure is that witnesses are pretty inconsistent on whether the Roswell ship was round, triangular, manta-shaped, but it's also argued that the idea for the B-2 bomber came from the Roswell crash. So that would kind of argue against the round or disc hypothesis, and we've already seen the 1944 Horton vehicle. But what we do know for sure is that the U.S. had scientists here working from German designs. While we do have real pictures of the Horton, there's yet another German prototype vehicle, the Lippisch P-13, that we only have sketches and models of, because while the Nazis were starting to work on the prototype, the war ended before anyone can verify one was actually built, and then Operation Paperclip grabbed up all the existing sketches, the prototypes, and the scientists they could relating to the craft. Here's a model of what, if built, it would have looked like. So, we've got German aircraft scientists who were designing and testing both the Horton and arguably the Lippisch. We're now doing so in the United States beginning in 1945. So what do you think? The Wikipedia reads, designed December 44, the Lippisch cockpit was located in the nose of the fuselage. Main landing gear comprised a retractable skid, while the rear of the aircraft will rest on the reinforced wingtips. Either it's really amazing how close the Germans got in World War II to designing ships that look amazingly like extraterrestrial spacecraft, or I'm suggesting another explanation. Maybe the German scientists who designed the Hortons and the Lippisch in 1944, given 2 years in U.S. secret labs with a blank check from Uncle Sam, maybe developed a spiffier model by July 1947. I think you can see at least where this part of the lecture is going. If I quit now and just let you understand the argument for a man-made craft at Roswell, most people, like I did, will bounce back to the questions, well, what about the bodies, and what about the fantastic metal found at the crash site? I certainly did, so I'll be getting to those very soon. And I just want you to keep in mind, I've introduced the topic of human experimentation by Nazi war criminals on American citizens already for a reason. But if you want to argue that the recovered Roswell craft was round, well, today there's a whole stream of research regarding other much more advanced models that the Germans were working on that weren't as similar to the stealth fighters. They were, in fact, round or disc-shaped. There's not time today to give you an exhaustive look, so to start your own research if you're so inclined, you can look at man-made UFOs, 50 years of suppression, Hitler's flying saucers. Those are photos, by the way. The author of this appears in the History Channel video I'm going to show you in just a moment. Project UFO from the 1990s, that's a brand new cover. And now this book and the sequel by the same author are really making some waves. His biography reads, Joseph P. Farrell was born in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and received his PhD in patristics, 1987, from Oxford. After teaching college for 17 years, he retired to pursue his interest in alternative science and history research. The Amazon description reads, in 1945, a mysterious Nazi secret weapons project, codenamed the Bell, left its underground bunker in Lower Silesia with its project documentation and the 4-star SS General Hans Kammler. Taken aboard 6 massive junker, ultra-long-range aircraft, Bell, Kammler, and all project records disappeared completely, along with the gigantic junkers carrying them. It has been speculated that it flew to Argentina. Remember the American Heritage article from earlier. Farrell was on Coast to Coast with Ian Punnett just this past March. If I had time, I'd play you some of the interview, but it's on YouTube, which is where this came from. Ian Punnett, the host of Coast to Coast, the weekend one, is now a big advocate of Joe Farrell's theories, by the way. Joseph Farrell posits that the Roswell craft actually originated in Argentina, where some of those German scientists wound up. He names 3 of them by name in the interview. But the Amazon description concludes, as a prelude to this disappearing act, the SS murdered most of the scientists and technicians involved with the project, which tells you that the U.S. did not get the ones that worked on the Bell. The Bell was a secret weapon that, according to one German Nobel Prize-winning physicist, was given a classification of decisive for the war, the highest security classification. Offered here is a range of exotic technologies the Nazis researched and challenges to the conventional views of the end of World War II, the Roswell incident, and the beginning of Magic 12, the government's alleged secret team of UFO investigators. Here's Farrell's newest book cover, which I haven't read. I just found it looking on Amazon, arguing that they came from Argentina. And I'm always eager to learn. You know, I'll change my mind based on new information. If he has a better theory than the U.S. scientists, but the point is just merely presenting. I think there are some valid arguments that the craft recovered in 1947 just didn't come from outer space. And I've concentrated mainly on the Horton model because of the photos and the Ken Arnold sightings that made flying saucers a buzzword in the United States media before July 47. You got to remember how much furor and hoopla surrounding the immediate global response to the 1947 Roswell Daily Record article was precisely because everybody already knew at that time these amazingly advanced airships were being seen all across the United States. They were reported on nationally, so the scoop of the century came when the headlines read, Roswell Army Airfield captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. The fact that there was now one on the ground and that perhaps Americans could finally know the truth about and find out what these amazing things were, it was just packed with promise and excitement. However, history tells us that didn't happen. The public was never permitted to find out the truth behind the Roswell crash. And if the line of reasoning I'm proposing has any resemblance to the truth, perhaps now we're beginning to see why. Because the phrase, "you can't handle the truth," does come to mind when I'm researching this. If there's any Nazi Operation Paperclip connection to the Roswell incident at all, I don't think 1940s Americana would have really wanted to know that we had hundreds of Nazis living here on secret military bases working for us to make sure we could defend this new title as undisputed world champion superpower. The president and the top military brass sure as heck didn't want to own up to it either, especially given that the president's explicit orders were disobeyed and circumvented by what would become known as the CIA. I'm simply suggesting that the moral outrage of that fact getting out in the 1940s, it would have been at least as bad and divisive an issue to our country as I believe the Vietnam War was in the 60s and 70s. But what I'm suggesting here even resembles the truth, I'd ask you to think for a minute on whether the government was actually right in covering it up. It's very highly debatable, of course, whether we should have even brought these guys into the country, but after World War II, we had the Cold War starting up, and all the evidence suggests that the Soviet Union and at least half a dozen other countries were taking these scientists and the technology into their borders. Where would we be today if we had not done the same? We'd be standing on the moral high ground for sure, but we'd probably also be a third world country. This is a tough call, no matter how you look at it. So, I previewed some of the craft that were being designed by Nazi Germany. I'm going to show you this History Channel program.
The story of the real UFOs begins in Nazi Germany. As victory in the Second World War was slipping from their grasp, German scientists were trying to perfect weapons that might turn the war in Hitler's favor. One of these was Victor Schauberger, an inventor who had produced models for a flying saucer. It had met the promise of a flying machine that could maneuver like a helicopter, but travel at supersonic speed undetected by the enemy. Schauberger's craft utilized a tornado-like vortex, which produced magnetic effects causing levitation.
The Germans had, in fact, gone far enough into development and testing that aircraft were in the air. And one company, Messerschmitt, and had flown a complete saucer-shaped aircraft.
These pictures of the early prototypes resemble photographs of UFOs that would emerge in the coming decades. But this was not the world of science fiction. These were highly advanced UFOs. This deadly development in warfare technology was to start a whole new era of military aviation history. The use of flying saucer technology to produce even more efficient killing machines was to be the culmination of this research.
During the Nazi period, we had a flowering of new thought, of scientific thought, of technological development. These scientists were freed up to do a lot of work. They developed science in every field that is relevant in our lives today. And as a matter of fact, We're still living off that carcass.
At their deadly weapons research facilities, scientists were working on a new generation of weapons. And alongside the rockets and missiles, real UFOs were a crucial part of that program.
One of the incredible things that happened during the Second World War was the amount of technology that German scientists were turning out that was devoted to a war effort. And that included rocketry, it included the jet engines, but it also included some remarkable work in terms of flying saucer craft.
But time was running out for Hitler and his scientists. On all fronts, the Allies were breaking through. The Germans were in retreat. The flying saucer technology, just like all of Hitler's other ultimate weapons, would come too late.
Even right to the very end of the war, it seems they really believed that these super weapons, these super delivery systems, were going to be able to at least stall the Allies, and they were going to be able to arrive at some sort of political settlement of the war.
Hitler's dream of winning the war with his super weapons never came.
You can, it's free viewing on history.com. Just go to history.com, search Real Nazi UFOs. I think you can still buy the whole thing. Some pretty amazing imagery and information for just 3 minutes. Let me be the first to say to you, though, don't believe everything you see on the History Channel, even if it comes out of my mouth. I don't want to undermine a premise that I put out myself to you today, but to end this portion, I'm going to share a more balanced thought with you from the Burlington News article on Hitler's UFOs. However, exactly what was being developed is now less a matter of historical record and more of an historical jigsaw, with not only pieces missing, but other pieces conceived in the minds of writers who then peddled fictitious Nazi flying saucer myths to those who chose to believe them. Establishing fact from fiction over 50 years ago is no easy matter, and we are forced to consider information that is largely unverifiable. Yet, when pieced together, a plausible story of Nazi flying disc technology does begin to emerge. So, in closing out the Nazi UFO portion of my website, I'd simply say the true facts are, in 1940 to 45, Nazi scientists were aggressively developing amazing flying machines. In 1945, the U.S. moved them to Fort Bliss, Texas, and to White Sands Proving Grounds, New Mexico, 200 miles away from the Roswell incident. In 1947, an unidentified flying object crashes in the New Mexico desert, and the military enforces the greatest cover-up of any event ever discovered by the American public. So with this new information in your head, perhaps the first time for many of us, my question becomes, where do you think the craft recovered in 1947 most likely came from? Mars? Alpha Centauri? Pleiadian star system? I'm not here to tell you what to think, of course, just to maybe make you think about this topic in a way that you probably never have before. And there's nothing wrong with that, because most of this information wasn't readily available to any of us until very recently. But switching gears finally for you, what about the bodies? I have to apologize in advance because I know this is going to offend some people. That's not my intent, but getting to the truth was, and I just let this research take me where it would, even though it turns out to be pretty dark. That previous section on Operation Paperclip, I introduced the ugly fact that the human experimentation was part of what the Nazi scientists were guilty of before they came here. Linked from my website, there's an article on the George Washington University's National Security Archives page. And unlike the NASA.gov and Army.mil pages that I used to link to support this theory, GWU has never removed this page since I started linking to it. Yay! But it's just a very plain text document that matter-of-factly discusses the paperclip scientists as well as the radiation experiments they conducted in the United States after they were here at the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine. It's addressed to members of the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, it reads in part. The Air Force's School of Aviation Medicine, SAM, at Brooks Air Force Base in Texas conducted dozens of human radiation experiments during the Cold War. Flash blindness studies, atomic weapons tests, data gathering for total body irradiation, studies conducted in Houston. And the experiments for which Nazi investigators were tried include many related to aviation research. These were mainly high-altitude exposure studies, oxygen deprivation, cold steady seas. The information about aircrew hazards was important to both sides. It continues elsewhere. A number of military research sites recruited paperclip scientists with backgrounds in aeromedicine and radiobiology. The portfolio of experiments at the U.S. Air Force's School of Aviation Medicine included total body irradiation and space medicine. And this is sad, in some effect damning, I'd say. But our government has at many times experimented on humans without their knowledge or their consent. There are many lists of acts like this online, just one from rense.com. 1931 injects human subjects with cancer cells and exposes American soldiers and civilian hospital patients to radiation. 1932, 200 black men diagnosed with but never told they have syphilis just so we could study the disease. 1935, we allowed a curable disease to wipe out portions of poverty-ridden black populations. 1943, U.S. begins research on biological weapons. 44, U.S. Navy uses human test subjects to test gas masks by locking them inside of a gas chamber filled with mustard gas. Operation Paperclip. 1946, hospital patients used as human guinea pigs for medical experiments. 1947, Atomic Energy Commission begins administering intravenous doses of radiation to human subjects. 47, LSD is tested on both military and civilians without their knowledge. This list goes all the way into the 90s. You might find this hard to believe, but as recently as 1997, Senator and former astronaut John Glenn submitted a bill to Congress to finally protect Americans from being research subjects without their consent. Addressing Congress, Senator Glenn said, "I began to ask the question, what protections are in place to prevent such abuses from happening? What law prohibits experimenting on people without their informed consent? What I found when I looked into it is that there is no law on the books requiring that informed consent be contained. I believe there's a need for such a law. I find it astounding that even after Nuremberg, we still don't have a law on our books requiring that informed consent be obtained prior to conducting research on human subjects." Finally, Mr. President, my legislator, that should be shocking to us all. 1997, John Glenn is recommending legislation that you and I have to be informed and give our consent anytime the government wants to experiment on us. But it's a fact that the U.S. government, and frankly anybody, had carte blanche to experiment on humans without their knowledge or consent because of some very serious loopholes in the legal system that Senator Glenn pointed out and addressed in his speech. That definitely includes the early days of the Cold War and the period between 1945 and July 47. So relating to Roswell, once you're not afraid to go where I don't think many Americans living in 1947 would have even dreamed of, there are definitely a few possible explanations for the reported bodies that have arisen. The most well-documented is proposed by well-known UFO researcher Nick Redfern in his 2005 book, Body Snatchers in the Desert, The Horrible Truth at the Heart of the Roswell Story. I didn't know Nick well when I was writing my website in 2002, much less that he was following some leads and sources about working on this book. But on my site, I put forth a total shot-in-the-dark hypothesis about the bodies. That being 2002, I don't remember exactly what inspired me to do this, but I was aware that human experimentation went on, and also the institutionalized people, those who wouldn't be as readily missed, were sometimes targets. I simply went to Google, and based on what the prominent Roswell storytellers claimed, I typed in symptoms: large bald head, big eyes. And I learned for the first time about progeria. And as I wrote on the website, I hope I've never been more wrong in my life. Children with progeria usually have these features: dwarf, bald head, large head with a small face, prominent eyes. Results in rapid aging of children, results in disproportionately small bodies given the size of their heads. The children are thin with baldness. Their head is disproportionately large and bald. But the math did start to add up. Nazis on U.S. soil, known for human experimentation, experimental craft, and a Cold War to win. Progeria was just the original line of thinking I posted in 2002 as a possible terrestrial explanation for the bodies. Nick Redfern and Dr. Heiser have likewise postulated the people in the crash ship could have been other human unfortunates, like POWs or radiation victims. Well documented that that was going on. And when Nick reviewed my website in 2002, he made the comment that I posted on there just because I felt honored to have someone of his stature give me a positive review. I would agree with you that the possibility that the Roswell bodies were human is very real, one that regrettably few researchers are looking into. The only problem I have with the progeria hypothesis is that progeria is extremely rare. Would the Nazis or the U.S. have been able to acquire 5 people with progeria, all of similar appearance and similar height, all in 1947? Well, apparently Nick looked into it a little more, and it turns out that the last chapter of his book that I'm going to be sharing from you with in a moment is titled Progeria. But before I read from this, just to get back to Dr. Heiser's, get him back in the picture, since he got me started on the paperclip, I got him started on the Progeria trail, I believe. This is from his site, which starts by saying that the view taken in the facade is that the Roswell crash of July 47 was in fact a paperclip accident. We have copies of Mike's facade down at the convention center. It goes on, the photo on the left, that's from a later date, that's an actual government photo, but it's not from 47. The facade argues that the object recovered at Roswell was an experimental craft modeled after flying discs designed during World War II by Nazi engineers. Under Operation Paperclip, the designs and know-how were exported to the U.S. via some of the same Nazi technicians who had begun the project in Germany. There was therefore some sort of connection between Majestic 12 and Paperclip. The facade further argues that the bodies recovered at the crash were human unfortunates, Mongoloids, Asians, progeria victims, etc., deemed worthy of the kind of human experimentation required for testing high-altitude craft. That's a Japanese Fugo balloon, or it's based on the Japanese Fugo balloon that Nick writes about in here. I'm going to have to skip reading Mike's excellent summary of Nick's book. I'm going to run through these just for those who want to freeze them on DVD later, and we already recorded this yesterday. But Mike's review ends with, or it continues with a very fair assessment of Stanton Friedman's review of Nick's book on this subject, which you can probably guess was less than favorable. But Mike charitably points out that it's fair that someone who has invested so many years of his life into promoting one view would indeed need a little more documentation than Nick provided to completely overturn Friedman's alien view, of course. But what about you, is my question. Because not everybody is as ardent in their belief that aliens crashed here as Stanton Friedman is, and I quite honestly consider my target audience for this lecture the undecided category, not so much the true believers. I think it's a cinch that the craft can be argued to be an Earth-made vehicle. Let me read you in Nick's words some documentation regarding the types of humans who, in general, were being experimented on in 1947 by the U.S. government. Reading just one paragraph from Nick's chapter, citing the November 1947 Biology Division Bulletin. Involved administering radioactive iodine to a particular group of physically and mentally handicapped children in an effort to try and better understand disorders of the thyroid. More specifically, the report focused on the results of a whole range of radiation-related experiments undertaken in mid-47 on no fewer than 54 test subjects, of whom 15 were between the ages of 1 and 4 years of age. 7 were controls, 2 were classic cretins, 1 showed some features of hypothyroidism and were not modified by the treatment, 2 were dwarfs, and 1 the diagnosis was gargoylism. 1 was suspected of progeria, a disorder associated with some of the features of hypothyroidism, and the last exhibited features of moderate sexual precocity. 27 were more than 4, but less than 15 years of age. Of these, 2 had unmistakable hypothyroidism, 2 Graves' disease, and 4 were dwarfs. I'm not asking you if you 100% believe Nick's hypothesis about some of those kids possibly playing into the Roswell incident, or my progeria hypothesis that was postulated before Nick introduced the fact of radiation testing on human subjects of experimental nuclear-powered ships that were so new they needed balloons attached to help fly, as that picture suggested. I'm not asking you if you believe Mike's hypothesis either. All I'm asking is, do you now believe that there could be a or any terrestrial earthly explanation for the bodies that were reported in 1947? The only images you've ever been exposed to of the Roswell bodies were based on something drawn third hand 46 years after the fact. This 1991 drawing accompanies Glenn Dennis's affidavit of his participation in the Roswell incident. At age 65, he is remembering what he claims an unidentified nurse drew for him. And Walter Henn drew these sketches based on what Glenn Dennis said he remembered in 1991 of this unidentified nurse's sketch, which he says he lost. Drawn third hand, 46 years later, that singular debatable image is the major source of almost all Roswell body stories you most likely ever heard of. I also submit for your consideration the drawings of Frank Kaufman, who was part of the 509th Army Air Base that handled and cleaned up the Roswell crash debris and the bodies, although there's no way of telling today how much of his testimony can be believed, unfortunately. This is what Frank Kaufman drew to describe the bodies he claimed to have personally witnessed. This is not a third-hand drawing, but first-hand. After he died, Frank Kaufman's overall testimony itself has been deemed as unreliable by Kevin Randall because they found a couple lies or a fake document. Along with Don Schmidt, they distanced themselves from his version of events. I just say this to remind you that every drawing of the Roswell bodies and the ship that you've ever likely been exposed to is based on testimony that the researchers who originally published the drawings and the book itself themselves now dispute as inauthentic. America and the whole world, I'm going to argue, is under a mistaken notion that I think can fairly and accurately describe as a modern mythology. These images don't look particularly alien, I'll submit, but I also submit that no drawings of the alleged bodies are considered reliable by the majority of any published Roswell researchers. All we know is that they are pretty universally said to have large heads, big eyes, and child-sized bodies. Something like this, I'm afraid. I'm not cueing this video, don't worry. But knowing that the high altitude and the radiation tests were among the exact human experimentation tests being run through the 40s, and that disfigured and so-called undesirables were among the favorite victims of such, what you know today about what different world governments have done in the name of science and research, my question to you, using Nazi scientists to carry out the dirty work, would you put it past them? Would you put it past them to put someone like this into an experimental craft just to see what the effects on the human body would be of perhaps never before achieved altitudes and speeds? Would you put it past our government, now or then, to use somebody like this to find out how much radiation the human body could safely absorb, assuming they're flying a craft with a brand new, untested, nuclear-powered engine or something? The nuclear subs went online in the 60s with admirals, captains, seamen, all that. You think they were the first ones exposed? They're underwater for years at a time, these subs. Do you think they put those guys first? Why are you going to risk losing Chuck Yeager when people like this are available and allegedly expendable? And I do apologize. I'm sorry. I know this is supposed to be a festival, and this kind of reasoning is not very festive. But if what I'm sharing here is anything close to the truth, it does kind of raise the celebration. What exactly are we celebrating in the first place? Is aliens the only possible explanation for any of the dead or dying bodies that might have been found at the 1947 crash site? I'm sorry, I'm sick to my stomach to have to report that the answer is patently no. There was a Cold War going on, and apparently both sides felt that it had to be won at any time. I'm not asking you to buy any one particular line of reasoning. Just answer for yourself. Now that you know what people in 1947, even in 1997, after the main books came out, now that you know what they didn't know then, I've already argued that the ship doesn't require a leap to alien spacecraft to explain anymore. I'm just asking you to consider, do the reports of the odd bodies require an alien explanation either? I'm almost done. I'm going to plow through the exotic metal material. The memory metal that many know was described as being very tough, but if crumpled or bent, it would go back to its original shape. There is absolutely nothing like that existed at the time, right? Right? There's much talk about all the marvels that were allegedly back-engineered from the Roswell crash, like the stealth bombers, for instance. Philip Corso's book. We now know that was not the case. To be clear, I am not saying that Colonel Corso was lying. I believe that he believed that he was telling in his book was true to the best of his knowledge. Whoever told him that our stealth technology was back-engineered from alien craft, or whoever told the person above him, or whoever created this famous filing cabinet that Corso was put in charge of, possibly was lying. But why would someone in the government do that to our military, or to those under themselves, we're going to ask? Colonel Corso actually suggests himself an answer for that question. Paragraph 3 of the introduction of his book tell us that before his involvement with the Roswell files, he knew a terrible secret that, quote, some of our government's most revered institutions had been penetrated by the KGB. Colonel Corso himself testified to this in 1962 and made a personal effort to get that information to President Kennedy. In fact, Tom Bauer, Linda Hunt both point out in their Operation Paperclip books that Lieutenant Colonel William Henry Whalen, who was running Operation Paperclip at the time, was convicted in 1962 of, quote, selling American defense secrets to the Soviet Union. Whalen is the highest-ranking American military officer to ever be convicted of espionage, in fact. The guy that ran Paperclip in 1962. And here's how intelligence and counterintelligence sometimes work when they suspect they have moles, and the CIA or the top military officials, they're trying to find out who to go after. You give one person some top-secret intelligence data or experimental technology, and you tell them it's of Russian origin, smuggled out by our spies. You give someone else that same information and tell them it's created from Tesla technology. You tell someone else it's created from an extraterrestrial craft, for instance. Tell someone else Westinghouse invented it and the government seized it under the military application law. None of these stories are perhaps true, but you create the documentation and you give it to 4 different people. Then you wait to see which fabrication makes its way to the Soviets, and you know who your mole is. There's also a memory metal out there today called nitinol that's also argued to have been developed after the immediate aftermath of the Roswell crash, as this website argues. Let's take a quick look at what nitinol does today when bent out of shape.
A bunch of scrumpled wire in a dish, but this is no ordinary wire. This is nitinol metal, which remembers a predetermined shape, and you can get back to that shape simply by pouring warmish to gently hot water, I would call this, over the piece, and see what happens. Goodness me. And there has the word, oh, turn it over, hot. So that's nicely done. And then you can take it out, cool it down, and scrumple it up again. And for many, many hundreds of times, it will restore itself to HOT for hot from a crumpled state. Remarkable product, nitinol wire.
This metal requires a temperature change to get back to its original shape. Just found it on YouTube for demonstration, but that's not the way the Roswell witnesses describe things happening. So this can't really be what they found, obviously. But starting again with good old Wikipedia, nitinol alloys exhibit shape memory and superelasticity. Shape memory refers to recovering the metal's original undeformed shape upon heating. Superelasticity, however, occurs at narrow temperature ranges, and get this, no heating is necessary to cause the undeformed shape to recover. So we ask, naturally, exactly how long has this stuff been around? Well, nitinol, by that name, was more or less discovered during research in 1962, not developed that we know of until a decade later. But the history of memory metals in general dates back, calling your attention to the red highlighted text, it turns out to 1932, according to this same Wikipedia article on nitinol. This source says the properties were first observed in 1938, also says no serious research advances were made until the 1960s. And again, I'm going to suggest none that we know of. But hopefully you can see already that if we had aircraft flying around in the United States that the general military and much less the general public had no clue existed, how much of a stretch is it to wonder if the memory metals first discovered in the 1930s might be making it into experimental crafts of the late 1940s. That's a full decade plus to have the US and then the German scientists given access to this material, secret laboratories to work in and develop. Nowadays we know it's pretty normal that new discoveries that might have military applications are kept out of the realm of the public for decades until the military has had first crack, and then they're seeded into mainstream technology. But the metal from the 47 Roswell incident was reported by Jesse Marcel Sr. and Jr. to be unlike anything known at the time, which usually leads to the explanation, well then it must be from outer space. Perhaps that's a further leap of logic than is actually necessary, knowing now that memory metals were first discovered in the 1930s. Interesting twist, just in May 2009, well-known UFO researcher Billy Cox publishes an article revealing that the files relating to the history of memory metals development in the 1940s are now missing. Surprise! Sorry. From both, they're missing from both the U.S. Air Force Base and the Battelle Institute, both of which should have them. I forward this article to Mike Heiser, who does some blogging. Mike notes that Billy Cox notes that nitinol can also be linked to the Oak Ridge Laboratory, a place that plays a key role in Nick Redfern's book, the part about radiation experiments on humans exposed to nuclear-powered aircraft engines. Mike adds that perhaps General Craigie went because he knew of a highly classified project involving a disc-shaped craft that employed the use of nitinol, a metal that had the properties described by Colonel Marcel. When Craigie heard the reports and did the math, he knew that the project had to be kept under wraps and attention diverted. Craigie had an office at Wright Field. He was in Washington. He flew immediately to Roswell. Keeping in mind the 1946 documentation, which originated in Wright Field, Ohio, detailing the use of the Horton technology, the obvious question that has to be posed is the reason the Roswell crash debris was taken to Wright Field, Ohio in the first place simply because that's where the top brass knew the whole picture actually worked out of. Put it another way, is it possible that General Craigie just wanted his nitinol back before it fell into the hands of the 509th bomb crew here? Was it possible that the 1947 debris taken to Wright Field, Ohio, because that's where the Nazi scientists were, as the Christina Gibson article from the beginning, crash and cover-up aside, they still needed to document the effects of the nuclear test flight on the bodies. Any or all of the above. Finally, closing out, in 1947, the general public and the most of the military knew absolutely nothing about the exotic flying crafts the Germans had invented or what the American government had in our possession and was working to replicate and improve upon before the Russians did so and wiped us off the map. If Americana 1947 citizens, they knew nothing about the 1930s discovery of memory metals, even though if you wear eyeglasses, there could be some in your frames today. Especially in 1947, American citizens would not have believed or even wanted to know that our own government was even remotely capable of fatally experimenting on its own citizens for any reason. The possibility of such well-documented atrocities now didn't even enter their minds. Of course not. We were the good guys, remember? We were the good guys. So when the Roswell incident happened in 1947, none of what I've shared to you today was even remotely within the realm of possibility to consider with the facts that the 1947 witnesses had in hand. All people knew for 50 years was that an exotic ship made of an unheard type of metal with strange bodies dying everywhere around it crashed in the desert and that the government enforced a cover-up of never before heard proportions. You also need to know that polls from the 40s and the 50s, unlike today, show that not 1 in 10 people believed in life on other planets existed, much less was visiting Earth. Like 2/3 plus today believe, according to the polls. It took some pretty courageous people thinking really outside the box to even go on record as considering that the Roswell wreckage might be from another world. Anybody willing to think outside the box on this event for even the first 50 years of the cover-up has done so at the risk of personal expense of extensive ridicule from peers and family. The witnesses who have come forward over the decades and the researchers who have affiliated their good names with these stories are to be commended for their courage, I'd say, in most cases. But I'm also suggesting that this proverbial box that the people have been thinking outside all this time is today much larger than we ever previously thought. I'm finally asking, do we even have to go outside the box today to account for the reported details of the Roswell incident? If everything we've discussed today was public knowledge in 1947 and news got out that our government recovered a flash-crying saucer in the New Mexico desert and then covered it up, what do you think most people really would have thought in 1947 if all this were public knowledge? Just perhaps something like, oh, it's probably just another one of those stealthy Horton Lippish spin-off things they're working on over in White Sands to fight the commies. Hope no one got hurt. What kind of legs do you think that the alien theory would have gotten over the last 6.5 decades if the average American in 1947 knew about Operation Paperclip or the Fantastic Flying Machines? Because the main strength behind the alien hypothesis of the 1947 incident is not anything resembling proof of extraterrestrial activity. It has always instead been the belief that there's just simply no other explanation for the reported and undisputable facts and extremely credible witness testimony. So I am gently and humbly, I hope, confronting that belief system today and asking you to rethink the entire event yourself, based on the preponderance of evidence made available to us all only very recently. I am today presenting to you that there are in fact many other possible explanations of all the reported details of the Roswell incident, And I'm suggesting that it's time for us all to rethink what we think we know about the Roswell event. Thank you very much for your time.